Well, yes, I'm a social anthropologist. A key method in social anthropology is participant observation. We deal with a wide range of all kinds of human behavior and practices. And if you feel a bit shaky after yesterday's evening, I actually published a paper on hangover. I thought this would be a moment to advertise it. But my actual talk today is about livelihoods on frozen ground, why permafrost matters to indigenous communities, not only in Siberia, but also elsewhere. And I will start with a short assessment of the public discourse, but also scientific discourse of what permafrost, why permafrost actually matters. We've heard a lot over the last days about global feedbacks, climate change, global warming, but also greenhouse gases, which again may feed back into global processes. If we speak about more regional or local aspects, we also have heard about not degradation of infrastructure, but rather the collapse of infrastructure and the problems that thermokarst and permafrost degradation pose before industrial infrastructure, but also residential buildings and stuff in the far north, in permafrost regions. And here I show a slide of Kolya Shiklamanov, who has presented this over the last days. And this is part of an ongoing network or project called RATIC. RATIC is Rapid Arctic Transitions Due to Infrastructure and Climate. And I advertise this project even though I'm not part of it. Why am I doing that? Because I think it's really relevant, it's very topical, and I see this as complementary to the work that we do. And we means the IPA, International Permafrost Association Action Group on Permafrost and Culture, but I will talk more within this talk. Let me return to RATIC for a moment. There is another project within RATIC by Timo Kumpola and his colleagues working on the effects of infrastructure on reindeer herders on Yamal Peninsula and adjacent regions. So here we speak about northwest Siberia. Timo and colleagues have spoken a lot about fragmentation of pastures, about also environmental pollution to some degree, but also even the most everyday routines of work, even without any hazards or without any sort of unintended pollution, will result in some impact on reindeer husbandry in this region. So, to return to the argument about public discourse and also scientific discourse, what we see is that indigenous peoples of the north are considered to be affected by both climate change, and that would include permafrost degradation, and industrial, mineral resource extraction and industrial activities in the north on their lands. So this is the usual narrative, and I think it is correct, but I would like to add a piece today. And to add that piece, the argument that I want to make, and which is perhaps a bit provocative, is that indigenous peoples themselves are modifying and have been modifying the landscapes wherein they live, and also that's an additional argument that permafrost degradation in some cases has actually not impeded but enabled traditional, what we now see as traditional indigenous land use. These questions and findings and the need for further discussion have inspired the work of this IPA Action Group, Permafrost and Culture, the task of which is to investigate the link between permafrost dynamics, local forms of land use, socioeconomic and climate change. And it has been established 2 years ago, and it has recently been extended for another 2 years. So that gives us the chance to discuss the interface between socioeconomic, including historical developments, and climate change, permafrost degradation, in an integrated manner. I will use 2 cases to make my claim. And case number one is the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, which is East Siberia. And my second case is much more further west, actually in the northeastern corner of Europe, which is the Republic of Komi and the Nenets Autonomous District. And I will then have a short conclusion. My first case, thus, is not far from the city of Yakutsk in the central Yakutian, lowlands or sediment plains. I think sediment plains would be the better term. We have had two conferences with the financial support by IASC, and this has been part of the ICOP3 process. There was a workshop in Helsinki in April 2014 and one locally in Yakutsk in summer 15, where we discussed from social scientists, historians and environmental scientists, geoscientists' point of view, the phenomenon of alas. And I'm going to explain what alas is. Basically what you see here in this picture are two, I think these can be described as thermokarst lakes, but not in a tundra landscape as we often see them and have seen them on slides. But these are located in the boreal forest zone. And the fact that there are these open lands which have formed as thermokarst depressions owing to the to warmer periods about 10,000 years ago. So I'm speaking about the Holocene climate maximum. What exists now is basically the not end product, but perhaps a ripe stage of a thermokarst process that has led over various boggy stages to this rather saturated landscape form with open land and a residual lake in the middle. And these areas are perfect for hay making and also for grazing cattle. And now enter nomadic pastoralists because in the 12th, 13th century, perhaps slightly later, we speak about a period of 200 to 300 years of immigration of pastoral nomads from their ancient homeland near Lake Baikal, maybe northern Mongolia. These people arrived in central Yakutia, these Turkic-speaking people arrived in central Yakutia after the year 1200 AD. And they found that these open lands, what they call alas, is ideal, as I explained, for actually continuing their cattle economy and horse breeding economy. So cattle and horse breeding, even under very adverse and cold climatic conditions, can happen in this region because of the forage they find and found then in the alas. Alas, as you know, is a word which entered the thermokarst lexicon. Permafrost research lexicon. All right, and so we've seen land use in this landscape over a period of 800 years, and we study the combined effects of environmental and socioeconomic change. These pictures show you that grazing the cattle, but also haymaking are ongoing activities. And what we also find is that humans have modified the landscape, not only in Soviet times, already earlier in Tsarist times, 19th, maybe even 18th century, to a smaller scale than what is happening now. What we see on this and on the next picture are actually forms of drainage, connected also with irrigation projects, which are part and parcel of the Soviet modernization project and the will or the intention to develop agriculture on a larger scale and more extensively, and then later more intensively. These pictures serve to show two things. On the one hand, what you can see is that the landscape around you, living or being a resident of central Yakutia, may change within one generation. So I owe this picture to Matthias Ulrich and Alexander Nikolaevich Fyodorov. And you see that from 1993 to 2013, a lake has formed, a thermokarst lake has formed in the middle of the forest. So these are processes that speak of a very rapid landscape development. And I would even use the word plasticity of the landscape. The upper row of imagery shows you these changes again, and I should note that I may not point it out on the slides now, but what is seen here is also the extension of fields, so that part of the forest has been plowed in order to grow different grains, crops, and that was a story that is very much related to the 1940s and 50s. But later these fields were thought to be either too scattered or too small, so what happened was a centralization of agricultural enterprises and a centralization of, or the concentration of agricultural activities. And while these fields were falling fallow, thermokarst processes were either going on or were an immediate consequence of that. So what we can say is that a lot of the landscape has changed for two factors, combined factors, one being thermokarst and the other one being socioeconomic processes such as centralization of agriculture. Currently, this alas, cattle, horse breeding, haymaking economy is in quite good shape, and one of the factors that actually is very highly influential is again the policy of centralization, but also the wish of young people to maybe not longer live in the village, but rather move to the city of Yakutsk. And so there are different factors and drivers like state substitutes in agriculture, or the attractivity of living in a village, transportation, access to that village, remoteness of that village, that actually shape the alas economy, and by that also shape the landscape. So that was my first case study, and it means that permafrost degradation can actually facilitate something which now appears to be a unique traditional indigenous form of land use. I will now turn to my second example. How am I doing time-wise? All right, okay. My second example is from the Republic of Komi, an entirely different area in terms of where it is located, but also in terms of vegetation, climate. This is tundra lowlands in the northeastern corner of the European continent. I worked there initially as a PhD student for two transdisciplinary projects, one called Tundra and the other one Spice. Both were coordinated by Peter Kuri, and if you are in the crowd, thank you very much for including me then and putting me on the track of studying reindeer herding in this region, because it's very much dominated by reindeer herding and environmental change and climate change. A few pictures will show you what reindeer herding in this region looks like today, and even though one may think this is sort of also quaint, traditional, and maybe not up to the standard of today's forms of ranching, this practice of reindeer herding is actually very young. It is not older than 350 years. It was the Komi, a people of the European North, Finno-Ugric people, that learned from their northern neighbors, the Nenets, how to herd reindeer in the first place. But the Nenets used reindeer only as for transportation and sometimes as emergency food. The Komi then did that differently. They developed this reindeer herding into a really big business, market-oriented business with lots of hides and meat coming out of that, being sold to Russians and merchants, and the skins even traveled also to other parts of Europe. Now, that also means an increase of the number of reindeer in that European part of Russia from roughly 100,000 maybe 400 years ago to 500,000 about 100 years ago, and still the number is about, I would think, 300,000 animals roaming Bolshezemelska tundra and other parts of the northeastern European tundra lowlands. All right, And all this, in order to understand now the interface between permafrost and landscape development and reindeer herding, it is important to know that herds of several hundred animals or even thousands of animals, up to 3,000 of animals, move regularly, migrate northward and southward. Here's a map that shows the pastures. Blue are winter pastures, green are summer pastures. And the summer pastures and autumn and spring pastures are located in a region of continuous, perhaps discontinuous permafrost. All right, now the reindeer have an immediate effect on the landscape by selective foraging and preference for some plants over others. So the very presence of large numbers of reindeer has an impact on the vegetation cover. However, I would treat this as a sort of direct impact in terms, if we look at permafrost. But there's also much more direct factor, which is the mechanical or physical impact of the animals. In order to explain that, I show you one picture of a corral or a site where reindeer are collected once or twice per year for different operations, including selecting animals for slaughter. Now, at these corrals, as you can see, reindeer, as they gather in large crowds, they actually have a very significant mechanical impact on the ground. And we have stories of reindeer herders sinking into the mud, which has formed by by disturbance of the active layer and by actually processes of thawing and thermocast. Now, the question of that is how quickly that happens. What we do know is that in some areas there's a thin layer underneath, we have mud, and once that thin layer is pierced, actually herders or animals can sink in, and there are many a story about that among reindeer herders of that region. Reindeer gather not just because humans decide to collect them, but sometimes under conditions of insect harassment in the summer, when it is as hot as now here, reindeer tend to cluster and then start spinning as if in a mill, and that also has an effect on the ground and may lead to either, destruction of the ground. Of course, one has to put that in context because there are other forms of land use and here transportation that have a much graver and much more serious effect on the landscape. And many of you have heard about all-terrain vehicles or the Russian Bezdikhod being one of the main factors of environmental damage or destruction or degradation in the far north in sensitive tundra ecosystems. So, I'm coming close to summing up my second case. I again want to present this slide to you because yesterday we had 3 sessions on ponds and lakes in thermocast regions, or permafrost regions. I used this slide in order to show that actually for you maybe this is thermocast land, for me this is reindeer herders land from above. I've been migrating with reindeer herders across this landscape from the southwestern corner of Hadearinsky, where you have oil and gas production, all across to the northeast. And I would like to just insert one remark about the lakes, since there was the discussion of bedfast ice lakes and floating ice lakes. These are also important from a reindeer herder's point of view because in bedfast lakes you will usually not find fish. So reindeer herders have a certain terminology for landscape features, and in terms of lakes they do differentiate between those with bedfast ice in the winter and those without. So to sum up my second case, the key message of my second case is that mobile pastoralism is modifying the landscape indirectly, but perhaps also very directly in terms of the cryosphere, the relief and hydrology. And in order to further develop that point, to what extent it actually happens, so not if it happens, but to what extent it happens, We need collaboration with hydrologists, but also with people who actually can chart the distribution of permafrost more nicely than it has been done so far. Okay, so all this, what I have to say, has an impact, or should make an impact on the way indigenous peoples and climate change are usually talked about in public and scientific debates. They are not just victims, they are part of those factors and drivers that modify the landscape. This one says conclusion number 2. So conclusion number 1 was to repeat the main messages. Conclusion number 2 is to go one step further and to try and assess future prospects for indigenous forms of land use. I keep that very short. Message number 1 is that what we've seen, climate change over centuries, over millennia, has of course shaped the landscape. Now, do indigenous peoples of the North have the capacity and ability of adapting to what we see as unprecedented environmental change going on right now in terms of global warming? This is very much under question. Some people are more positive about the potential to adapt. Others say, no, this is a state of alert and alarm. We should actually we should support indigenous peoples even in finding new strategies to deal with environmental change. At any rate, serious impacts are to be expected in all subarctic regions, not just those which I presented. Also, let me add here that, again, in order to assess future prospects, we need a combined analysis of socioeconomic processes and environmental processes, and permafrost is one part of that. There are examples of really what I call here highly resilient, and this is actually not me, this is Bruce Forbes and Timo Kumpula speaking about highly resilient reindeer herding cultures and groups, communities on Yamal Peninsula, so again, West Siberia. And so if you think that reindeer herding is something of yesteryear, no longer going to take place in the future, this is definitely not the case. We see regions where reindeer husbandry is of growing influence and is of growing importance for people, with a very lively, I could say, healthy nomadic culture behind that. Then the second but last message has already been told. Now, in order to move on, what I think what social scientists are continually and notoriously bad at is modeling. There are hardly any social scientists willing to make any predictions or assessments that go beyond a time horizon of 25 years. So if we want to carry out joint projects, transdisciplinary projects, we have to think about how to actually align our time horizons. Social scientists don't think in geological eras, but rather have a very short-sighted view of the future. And here we could use some help. Conclusion and outlook then. Members of the IPA Action Group, some of them are here in the room. I'm one of them. We would like to discuss with you and have your input on the following topics. What we need are more detailed data on the distribution and dynamics of ice-rich permafrost. So the Jedoma group has been working to that end, and I think what I see as a fruitful basis for cooperation would be to continue that work west of the Urals in Bolsheziemska tundra and other lowlands of Russia. The second, hydrology. We need desperately hydrologists to talk with about the processes of pond and lake development and also drainage. So the Central Yakutian example was all about drainage, partly also about irrigation. These processes cannot be understood without hydrology, of course. And thirdly, what I already mentioned, we have to jointly tackle the challenge of modeling midterm and long-term socioeconomic changes along with landscape development. By that, I want to close, and I want to thank the organizers of this conference, plus a lot of people who actually inspired this work. To name them all would be too long. I just want to say that I'm very grateful for the opportunity that I had to speak to you on this topic. Thank you.